You won't believe the chilling ending of this sinister tale. Chapter 1. The Stranger. Dark Hollow wasn't a town for outsiders. Nestled between dense woods and a narrow, winding road, it was the kind of place you passed through but never stayed. For years, it had remained quiet, content with its small population and even smaller ambitions. People liked it that way, or so they thought. That all changed the night he arrived. It was a thick, moonless night when the stranger drifted into town, nearly swallowed by the mist that curled up from the riverbank. No one saw where he came from, but soon enough, there he was, a figure half shrouded in darkness, loitering outside Harlan's diner. The few people still out at that hour caught glimpses of him under the dim streetlights. Tall, dressed in a dark coat and an old-fashioned fedora that cast a shadow over his face. He barely moved, but his eyes followed every person that walked past. Sheriff Dan Hodges noticed him the next morning. Hodges was a broad, weather-beaten man with a hard stare and a sense for trouble. Over his years in Dark Hollow, he'd learned to sniff out outsiders who didn't belong, but this man was different. The stranger's presence didn't feel like the harmless curiosity of a traveler passing through. He exuded something darker, something that made the hairs on the back of Hodges' neck prickle. For the next few days, the stranger haunted the edges of town, standing outside the diner or lurking near the post office, always watching. He never spoke, not even when people threw him wary glances or mothers pulled their children close as they passed by. Some folks swore his eyes had a sharpness to them, like two black coals smoldering beneath his hat. By the third day, the whispers had started. Some townspeople said they recognized him but couldn't place from where. Others claimed he looked like a character from an old nightmare. When Sheriff Hodges finally gathered his nerve and approached him, he felt the unshakable chill of those dark, piercing eyes. "Got some business in Dark Hollow?" Hodges asked, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd seen his fair share of trouble. The stranger paused, then lifted his head, his mouth curling into an unsettling smile. "Just visiting an old friend," he replied, his voice low, like gravel against metal. There was an edge to his tone, a mocking warmth that didn't reach his eyes. "Mind telling me who?" Hodges demanded, folding his arms to steady himself against the unease creeping up his spine. The stranger only chuckled, a hollow sound that echoed down the quiet street. "It's a private matter, Sheriff. Best not to get involved." Hodges held his gaze, feeling a wave of discomfort rise in his chest. But before he could ask another question, the stranger tipped his hat and walked off into the mist, leaving Hodges standing alone, the silence closing around him like a trap. What do you think of the stranger's intentions? Stay tuned for the next chapter. Things are just getting eerie. Chapter 2. The Marks. In a town as quiet as Dark Hollow, small disturbances rarely went unnoticed, and soon the townsfolk were murmuring about more than the stranger's presence. That Sunday morning, when Mr. Brody the butcher came to open his shop, he was greeted by a shock. There, scrawled on his door in what looked like dried blood, was a strange symbol. A twisted spiral with jagged edges that seemed to bore into the wood itself. Shaken, Brody cleaned it up, but the mark wouldn't fully disappear, even under scrubbing. Worse, the symbol seemed to cling to his thoughts. Its shape burned into his mind like a nightmare that refused to fade. By afternoon, he'd heard from others. The same mark had appeared on the front doors of the bakery, the post office, and the sheriff's station. Sheriff Hodges, already on edge from his encounter with the stranger, inspected each mark, his gut tightening, with a feeling he couldn't quite name. They were alike, yet subtly different, each one carved or drawn with a twisted purpose that defied easy explanation. "It's probably just some pranksters," he told the gathered townsfolk, but his voice held a tremor of doubt. Deep down, he knew this wasn't a prank. The way the marks twisted and spiraled, They seemed to vibrate with a dark energy, like the signature of something not altogether human. That night, an even greater fear gripped the town. Little Lily Harrigan, just 6 years old, vanished from her family's yard while her father stepped inside to fetch a glass of water. The family had only looked away for a few moments, they said, but that was all it took. By the time they turned back, Lily was gone, as though she'd been swallowed by the earth itself. Dark Hollow erupted in panic. Every able-bodied man and woman joined the search, combing the forests and peering into every shadowy corner. But after hours of searching, they found no trace of her. Not a single footprint or clue to suggest where she might have gone. Sheriff Hodges organized the efforts, but his mind kept flashing back to the stranger's unsettling words, just visiting an old friend. As the search wore on into the early hours of the morning, Hodges finally returned to his office, exhausted and haunted by a dread he couldn't shake. When he reached his office door, his breath caught in his throat. There, on his door, was another of the twisted symbols, darker and more pronounced than the others he'd seen. It seemed to pulsate, drawing him closer until he could almost hear it, like a whisper curling from the shadows, calling his name. Curious to uncover the stranger's connection to these strange events. Don't miss the next chapter as secrets unravel. Chapter 3. The Whispered Warnings. Sheriff Hodges could barely sleep that night. The twisted mark on his office door had unsettled him in a way he couldn't shake, haunting his dreams with dark spirals and the faint, cold whisper of his name. He woke early, a dull ache in his head, and found himself at the diner before dawn, nursing a cup of black coffee. The diner's owner, Marla, moved behind the counter, casting wary glances at the sheriff, who seemed more drawn and grim than usual. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Dan," she said, her voice breaking the early morning hush. Hodges managed a weak smile, though his mind was still tangled with questions. "Feels like I have, Marla. Dark Hollow's seen more trouble in the last few days than in the past 10 years. Marla leaned in, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "You think that stranger's behind it? Folks say he was watching Lily Harrigan before she disappeared. He was near the Harrigan place, just standing there." The sheriff's pulse quickened. He had suspected the stranger but needed more than rumors and sightings to take action. But hearing Marla's words only added weight to his growing dread. He nodded slowly, his mind racing with the same unanswerable question: who was this stranger? And what did he want with Dark Hollow? Just then the doorbell chimed and a figure entered the diner. Sheriff Hodges tensed, his hand drifting instinctively toward his holster. But it wasn't the stranger, it was Pastor Warren, looking just as shaken as the sheriff felt. The old man took a seat across from Hodges, setting his Bible on the table with a troubled sigh. "Dan, I'm worried," Pastor Warren said, his voice low. "I found one of those symbols on the church door this morning, and—" He swallowed, his hand shaking as he opened his Bible, revealing pages with words scrawled over in an ink that appeared to be, no, had to be, blood. This was waiting on the pulpit. Hodges felt a chill crawl up his spine. The twisted symbols in the church, the Bible marred with blood, everything felt wrong. Dark Hollow had known its share of oddities over the years, but nothing like this. "What does it mean?" he whispered, almost to himself. Pastor Warren shook his head, his eyes dark with worry. "Whatever it is, it's no prank, Sheriff. It's like a warning. A curse, maybe. I fear this man, this stranger, brings a darkness with him, something ancient and foul." The sheriff knew then that he had to confront the stranger, even if he lacked evidence. Too many unanswered questions had piled up, and the fate of little Lily Harrigan gnawed at his conscience. He couldn't let fear or hesitation stop him. Someone had to get answers. By nightfall, Hodges was patrolling the outskirts of town, his flashlight cutting through the dense fog that had settled over the woods like a suffocating blanket. Dark shapes flickered at the edges of his vision, twisting tree branches that seemed almost alive, reaching out like fingers from the shadows. Finally, he saw him. The stranger stood just beyond the tree line, still as a statue, watching him with those cold, impenetrable eyes. Hodges called out, his voice cutting through the silence. "Enough games. I want answers. Who are you, and what do you want with Dark Hollow?" The stranger didn't move, but a small, eerie smile crept across his face. "I told you, Sheriff. I'm here to visit an old friend." Hodges took a step forward, his heart pounding. "And who would that be?" The stranger's smile widened, and his voice, when he spoke, was barely more than a whisper, like the distant hum of a memory. "Oh, but you know her well, Sheriff. Perhaps better than anyone else." Hodges' blood ran cold as the implications hit him. Before he could speak, the stranger lifted a hand and pointed toward the heart of Dark Hollow. The night seemed to thicken around him, his form fading until he was no more than a shadow, a presence that lingered even after he disappeared. As Sheriff Hodges stumbled back toward town, a horrifying thought took root in his mind. This man, this thing, wasn't here for just anyone. He was here for someone special, someone the sheriff could no longer protect. What terrifying truth lies ahead? Don't miss the next chapter as the past begins to unravel. Chapter 4. The Missing. Dark Hollow was reeling by the next morning. News of the stranger's sinister presence spread like wildfire, filling the town with a mix of dread and curiosity. But it wasn't just the townsfolk talking. Everywhere people looked, new twisted symbols appeared, on homes and shops, even the cemetery gates, and they seemed to multiply overnight, each one unique, each one darker and more menacing than the last. By midday, yet another person was reported missing, Thomas Barlow, a quiet man who ran the local hardware store. His wife had last seen him the previous night, locking up the shop. She'd waited up for him, and when dawn came without any sign of him, she went to the sheriff in tears. Hodges now had 2 disappearances on his hands, and as he stood at the entrance of the hardware store, he noticed another symbol carved into the doorframe. This one was sharper, darker than the rest, as though it had been etched in a rage. He ran his fingers over the jagged lines, a chill running down his spine. Something sinister was growing, feeding on the fear and confusion that gripped Dark Hollow. And the more he searched, the more he felt that these symbols were not just marks. They were invitations. An invitation to an unspeakable darkness lying just beneath the town's surface. Determined, Hodges gathered a search party, urging every able-bodied man in town to join. They combed the forest, split up into small groups, each man equipped with flashlights and whatever tools they could muster. The deeper they ventured, the more the woods seemed to close in, the towering trees casting twisted shadows that danced with each beam of light. Hours passed with no sign of Thomas Barlow or little Lily Harrigan. Just as Hodges was about to call off the search, he caught sight of a clearing up ahead. At the center stood an ancient stone altar, weathered and cracked, with strange symbols carved into its surface. Symbols that matched those that had been appearing around town. Beside the altar, partially hidden beneath a pile of dead leaves, lay something small and pale. His heart pounding, Hodges moved closer, lifting the leaves away until he uncovered a small doll, Lily's favorite, worn and tattered from years of play. It lay on the ground like an offering, a silent testament to the evil lurking in their midst. Sheriff Hodges staggered back, horror twisting in his gut. He knew now that the stranger wasn't just a man. He was something far older, something that had been waiting, watching. And whatever it was, it had returned to Dark Hollow to claim what had been left unfinished. An ancient evil has awakened in Dark Hollow. Ready to discover what horror lies next? Keep reading, if you dare. Chapter 5. The Ritual. The discovery of Lily's doll beside the ancient stone altar sent shockwaves through Dark Hollow. Sheriff Hodges returned to town, his mind clouded with dread and questions he feared could never be answered. As he staggered back to the station, he couldn't shake the feeling that each step was being watched, as though a pair of eyes followed him from the shadows, taking in his every move. By the time he reached his office, a crowd had gathered outside. News of the search's chilling find had spread, and the townsfolk were desperate for answers. Hodges, pale and weary, took a deep breath before addressing them. "There's something strange happening in Dark Hollow," he began, choosing his words carefully. "These symbols, these disappearances, they're connected. We've found something in the woods that suggests this is more than just random incidents." Murmurs erupted in the crowd. Fear flickered in their eyes as they exchanged panicked glances. Someone from the back shouted, "Is it that stranger? Is he the one behind this?" Hodges wanted to say yes, to blame it all on the mysterious man who'd brought this darkness to their quiet town. But he knew that would be too simple. No, the stranger was not the cause. He was merely a harbinger, a vessel for something much older and far darker. "Listen to me," the sheriff said, his voice steadying as he tried to calm the crowd. "I need everyone to stay vigilant. No one goes out alone. We'll keep searching for Lily and Thomas, but for now go home, lock your doors, and if you see that stranger, don't approach him. Come find me." The crowd slowly dispersed, their fear palpable as they hurried home. But as Sheriff Hodges turned to enter his office, he noticed Pastor Warren lingering behind, his face etched with worry. "Dan, we need to talk," the pastor said, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's something I haven't told you, something I think may explain what's happening." Hodges motioned him inside, and together they sat in the sheriff's dimly lit office. Pastor Warren pulled a small, crumbling book from his coat pocket and placed it on the desk. Its cover was faded, the pages yellowed with age, but the symbols etched into the leather were unmistakable. "I found this in the church basement, hidden behind a wall," Warren said, his voice quivering. "It speaks of an ancient ritual, a summoning that requires sacrifices. The stranger, he's performing this ritual. He's feeding the darkness that's lain dormant here, and with every life he claims, it grows stronger." Sheriff Hodges felt a wave of nausea as he flipped through the brittle pages, each one filled with arcane symbols and descriptions of rituals designed to summon something monstrous. "Why here?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why Dark Hollow?" Pastor Warren hesitated before answering. "Because Dark Hollow was built on cursed land. The original settlers believed it held a power, something they thought they could control. But they were wrong. The darkness demanded sacrifices, and when the settlers refused, it lay dormant, waiting for someone like the stranger." The weight of Pastor Warren's words sank into Hodges like a stone. As night fell over Dark Hollow, Sheriff Hodges gathered a small group of townsmen, willing to face whatever was lurking in their woods. Armed with flashlights, ropes, and whatever makeshift weapons they could muster, they set out toward the altar, each man steeling himself for what he might find. The woods were silent as they marched, the only sound the crunch of leaves beneath their boots. This wasn't just a series of misfortunes, it was a reckoning, a return of something malevolent that had once terrorized this land. And now the stranger was here to finish what had been left undone. "Then we stop him," Hodges said, his jaw clenched. "Whatever it takes. The ritual has begun, but can Sheriff Hodges stop it in time? Don't miss what happens next." Chapter 6. The Confrontation. The closer they got to the altar, the heavier the air became, thick with an unnatural fog that clung to their skin like oil. Shadows twisted in the corners of their vision, shapes that seemed to shift and dissolve whenever they turned to look. Finally, they reached the clearing. The altar loomed before them, its cracked stones slick with something dark and sticky, and standing beside it was the stranger. his face hidden beneath the brim of his hat. "Welcome, Sheriff," he said, his voice calm, almost amused. "I knew you'd come." Hodges took a step forward, gripping his flashlight tightly. "This ends here. Whatever you're doing, whatever darkness you're bringing into our town, it stops tonight." The stranger chuckled, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. "I'm afraid it's already begun. The town's fate was sealed long before you arrived, Sheriff. I am merely fulfilling what was promised centuries ago." "Promised?" Hodges spat, his voice laced with anger. "By who?" "By those who built this town," the stranger replied. "They struck a deal, a pact that would keep Dark Hollow safe in exchange for devotion and sacrifice. But they grew weak, turned away from the pact, and so the darkness has waited, biding its time until it could feed once more." The sheriff's grip tightened as he glanced at his companions, their faces mirroring his fear and determination. They were outnumbered, outgunned, but Hodges knew he couldn't back down. "Whatever pact was made, it's over now," he said, stepping closer. "We're not going to let you take any more of us." The stranger's smile faded, replaced by a cold, calculating stare. "You're brave, Sheriff, but bravery alone won't save you." Without warning, he raised his arms, and the symbols on the altar flared to life, glowing with a sickly green light. The air vibrated with a low, rumbling hum, and from the shadows surrounding them, shapes began to form. Twisted, dark figures with hollow eyes and clawed hands, their bodies seeming to pulse with an otherworldly energy. Hodges felt a surge of terror as the figures drew closer, their hollow eyes fixed on him and his men. He knew then that they were up against something far more powerful than he had ever imagined. But he had to try, had to fight. "Now!" he shouted, and together they charged toward the stranger, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they swung their weapons at the encroaching shadows. The creatures let out guttural hisses, retreating momentarily before surging forward with renewed ferocity. As Hodges fought, he kept his focus on the stranger who stood by the altar, unmoving, his eyes locked on the sheriff. The two men's gazes met, and in that moment, Hodges felt a flicker of something. Doubt, a weakness he could exploit. He broke free from the melee, pushing past the shadowy figures until he stood face to face with the stranger. With all his strength, Hodges swung his flashlight, striking the stranger across the face, the blow landing with a sickening thud. The stranger staggered, his hat falling to reveal a face that seemed to shift and twist, as though it were only a mask hiding something far more terrible beneath. "You cannot stop this," the stranger hissed, his voice warped, inhuman, but Sheriff Hodges didn't relent. He raised his flashlight, ready to strike again, determined to end this nightmare once and for all. Will Sheriff Hodges triumph, or will the stranger's ritual claim Dark Hollow? The final chapter awaits. Chapter 7. The Final Sacrifice. The stranger recoiled, his twisted face shifting between shades of human and something far darker, his expression contorted in fury. Sheriff Hodges stood his ground, heart pounding, his makeshift weapon trembling in his hands as he faced the entity that had haunted Dark Hollow and threatened everything he cared about. The shadowy figures surrounding the altar hissed and writhed, forming a protective ring around their master, but Hodges was undeterred. He could feel the fear in his companions, yet he could also see the same fierce determination in their eyes. They weren't just fighting to survive. They were fighting to reclaim their town from whatever darkness the stranger had brought with him. "Enough!" the stranger bellowed, his voice deepening, reverberating through the trees like the roar of a storm. He raised his arms, and the altar pulsed, sending waves of energy that nearly knocked the sheriff off his feet. Hodges stumbled, his vision blurring as the green light twisted into shapes, symbols dancing through the air. Then, to his horror, he saw two familiar faces, Lily Harrigan and Thomas Barlow, emerging from the shadows, their forms translucent, trapped within the depths of the stranger's summoning spell. "Let them go!" Hodges yelled, his voice hoarse, his anger rising above his fear. The stranger chuckled darkly, shaking his head. "They are merely the beginning, Sheriff. Their lives are offerings, fuel for the power that will make me whole." Hodges lunged forward, his flashlight raised, but the stranger raised a hand, and with a flick of his wrist, sent the sheriff sprawling backward. Pain shot through Hodges as he hit the ground, but he forced himself to stand, his eyes fixed on the writhing figures of Lily and Thomas. He couldn't let them suffer. He couldn't let this twisted creature have them. Desperation filled him as he scanned the altar, his mind racing for anything he could use to break the spell. Then he remembered Pastor Warren's words. It's a summoning. Something monstrous. It hit him. The stranger wasn't fully here. Not yet. His presence required energy to stabilize, to solidify, and he was drawing that energy from the captured souls. Without them, his power would fade. With one last surge of determination, Sheriff Hodges picked up a heavy stone from the ground, holding it above the altar. The stranger's eyes widened in rage as he realized what Hodges intended to do. "No!" he roared, his voice laced with desperation, for the first time showing a crack in his confidence. "You don't know what you're doing!" But Hodges did know. He was severing the stranger's link to this world, sacrificing the altar, the very anchor that held the stranger's form in Dark Hollow. Ignoring the stranger's protests, Hodges brought the stone down with all his strength, shattering the altar's center. The twisted symbols that lined its surface dissolved, and the green light began to fade, flickering as though an invisible cord had been cut. A terrible scream echoed through the woods, a sound that seemed to tear through reality itself. The shadowy figures around the stranger began to dissolve, their forms twisting and writhing before vanishing into the air. The stranger staggered, his body flickering, his face a mask of fury and despair as he struggled to maintain his hold on the physical world. "You may have won this time, Sheriff," he hissed, his voice a guttural rasp, "but the darkness never forgets, and it will return." With one final hateful glare, the stranger faded, his form disintegrating like ash caught in the wind, leaving nothing but silence in his wake. The clearing went still. Hodges lowered his head, a heavy sense of exhaustion settling over him. He turned to where Lily and Thomas had stood and found their forms fading gently, peacefully, their expressions serene as they disappeared into the mist, freed from the stranger's curse. As dawn broke over Dark Hollow, Sheriff Hodges and the remaining townsfolk made their way back to town, their hearts heavy but relieved, knowing they had narrowly escaped an unspeakable fate. Dark Hollow was safe again for now, but the memories of that night would forever haunt its people, a reminder of the darkness that lurked beneath their quiet town. The end.
If you enjoyed our story, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications.